Hey, Nia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, I wanted to talk about the new podcast series that you've started. India and Pakistan have both just celebrated their respective independence days. It's been over 70 years since the partition of those countries. Tell us about this historical event and why you felt it was important to do this podcast series.
Yeah, so I was born in Karachi in Pakistan and immigrated to the US with my parents when I was a baby. And I never really knew about partition. Like, I obviously knew that Pakistan used to be a part of India, but I didn't really know, like, just how horrible that event was and what actually transpired until I went to Pakistan for the first time and saw an exhibit at the mall in Karachi, and that's kind of where I got my first like taste of what actually happened because my parents didn't talk to me about it, other relatives didn't talk to me about it. I grew up in Texas, and I definitely didn't learn about it in school. So, which is just still so surprising to me because it's such a large event and it shapes the country politically, geographically. So I'm like, why do we not know about this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I there's a filmmaker I really like. Her name is Sharmina Bey Chinoy. She's a two-time Academy Award winner from Pakistan, and she created this exhibit called Home 1947.
Mhm.
And I think when I was on the mall website, I saw that that was going to be there, and I'm like, oh great, like let's see this, you know, it's going to happen while we're in town. But I don't really think I grasped what exactly the exhibit was about because I think I just saw her name and was like, oh great, I want to go. And then like me and my parents go to the exhibit, and it's just like shock after shock after shock because you see like, horrible statistics. You see um, interviews of people talking about their experiences with partition. You see objects that were there that people took with them. And, it's a collaborative effort with, the Partition Archive, the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, like all these different culture entities. And I'm just like, just going insane, like what is happening? And I don't have a poker face. So I think I just looked very alarmed and
Mm.
surprised and everything the entire time. And then afterwards, like we go to the food court and we're just eating KFC. And I'm like, what is this? Like, you need to tell me about this. Like, it was
Yeah.
so insane. Like, I'm like waving a chicken strip and I'm just like, what, just like so out of it. And like, please, like, tell me what happened. And so my parents did tell me a little bit, and like ever since then I've just really been interested because I'm just like, how can something be so big? And and I'm like, this directly affects my family. It was my grandparents who went through it. And yes, I was born in Pakistan, but it was only my parents who were born there. Every other generation of my family was born in India, so like our roots are there.
Mhm.
And during when COVID first happened, I was wanting to write a lot more, and I
Mhm.
was like, this would be a good like narrative limited series, I thought. And I was
Mhm.
like, let me try to write this. But it's just so much. I don't know where to start, and so it was kind of like put on the back burner, but something that was always on my mind. And then in the summer of last year, I saw that iHeartRadio was creating a program called Next Up, where they would pick a couple of people from underrepresented communities and kind of teach them the world of podcasting. And it was like 6 months or so, and it was paid, which is awesome. A lot of fellowships
Wonderful.
aren't paid,
Always good.
and yeah, always good. And that's when I thought, I was like, maybe this would make for a good podcast because it is such a complex story. There's a lot of layers. So,
So not only
in
were you coming into this whole topic, but you're also learning this whole podcasting
yes,
experience as well. And
right,
I agree with
and
you. Podcasting is just a hugely engaging and very popular way of communicating information. I just wanted to know more about the actual subject matter and how you went about it. What was it like to hear the stories, especially for, because I know you spoke to your own family members and others. What was it like to hear their stories and how they lived through partition? And I wondered if you felt or have seen any manifestations of the generational trauma that you mentioned. I think I read about that. So is that something that you actually, after speaking to them, realized that actually I can see where some of their behavior comes from?
Yeah, I think when I spoke to my grandpa, and I'd spoken to my parents too. I know my mom is on the show, but just I had like a lot of conversations with people, and it was just like I mentioned in the first episode, that my paternal grandparents lived with us in Texas, but I was hanging out with them and talking with them and everything, but never once did I ask about their lives,
Mm,
you know, and and yes, I didn't know about partition, but I still feel very guilty about never asking about that.
mhm,
And I think it's for me, I think I'm a sensitive person. I feel things very deeply. So I feel like I carry all of those emotions like inside. So like if they're telling a story, it's like I feel it. And you can
mhm,
also feel it because partition is something that continues to rule our lives.
mhm.
It is the reason why India and Pakistan have the relationship with each other as they do now. It is the
Absolutely.
reason why those borders are so closed off to the other.
Mm,
Um, and every time I talk to someone, whether it be an oral historian, a student, an artist, they're like this. It's like a living, breathing thing because everything about our families can be traced back to partition. And I know a lot of people say like, oh, if I decided to do like if I just made a different decision, my life would be completely different. But that really is the case here because a lot
mhm,
of people, had converted to another religion for safety reasons. A lot of people thought that they could go back when they couldn't and like buried objects in their homes. A lot of people were died, a lot of people were murdered, kidnapped, and it's just like if my grandparents on all sides were teenagers, like they weren't married to their respective partners, so it's like what if they decided to do any of those things, like
yeah,
so
yeah.
it's very much rooted in our identity. And the fact that I was born in Pakistan makes it incredibly unlikely for me to ever visit India.
Mhm.
And vice versa. Like if you're from India, it's very hard to visit Pakistan unless, it's like an academic thing or something like that. Like it's very hard
Mhm.
to get your visa approved.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even though I have a US passport, it still says where you're born, so,
In the series, do you speak to, I know you obviously have a Pakistani Muslim heritage. Do you
mhm.
speak to people who are either Sikh or Hindus in the
Yes, I speak
series?
to a number of different people. Yeah,
Okay,
so I
that's
have my family, and then I've spoken to other Muslims. Someone who is Sikh did a voiceover for a character in episode, not a character, I'm sorry, for an author excerpt from a book in
mhm,
episode 2. I speak to a lot of Hindus, even people who are not South Asian. So one of the professors I speak to, who is a South Asian historian, is a white male professor from the University of North Carolina. And so I talked to him. And then I talked to some students, one who is South Asian, has a similar, who also, she was born in India and came to the United States as a baby. So we have like a
mhm,
similar kind of story. And
mhm.
then one of the students was white because I wanted to get just different perspectives about like how people learn about things and like and stuff like that. So I talked to a whole number of different people from different backgrounds, different heritages, cultures, languages,
And I
because I
wonder, were
just
you
wanted to
able
see.
to, so I mean, you have your, background. Do you think you were able to sort of navigate and stay neutral or impartial? And also whether some of the people that you spoke to, possibly from a certain generation, did you feel any residual sectarian sort of feelings all these years later?
So when I first wanted to do the podcast, I did want to be very fact based and I didn't want to have any kind of bias, but it was just something that didn't really happen because, like I said before, like it's like this is our family history. Like this is something that is inside me. And I feel like you
Mhm,
can't be impartial to something that plays such a heavy part in your life and identity for future generations to come. So
mhm,
I I tell the lens in which I tell the stories more from a discovery perspective. So if anything, it's probably biased against the British because of a lot of a lot of it happened because of them and like
yeah.
obviously South Asian politicians as well. Um, but you could also say that the history aspect, I think, is like the least important part of the podcast, because I talk about it, but what I really want to get into are survivor accounts and stories that have been silenced. So I interview a woman who was 4 years old when partition happened, who wrote a book to to cope with her trauma from the event because she disassociated herself with it a lot,
Mhm.
and I spoke to I was like an artist who makes these beautiful installations called counter memories and anti memorials, and those two, I don't want to say things, but those two ideas come from going against what the national narrative is. Like, so this great men in history narrative, like, we have the
Mhm.
airports named after Jinnah and like statues and universities and like all these things. But, and, and I kind of talk about how a lot of male agendas get in the way of trying to make a sensible solution, because a lot of, from my understanding, from what I read, and I want to be clear in saying that I'm not a historian, but
Mhm.
like my understanding is that a lot of people's agendas got in the way because they're like, well, we want Pakistan, like we want this area, we want this area. The British is like, well, okay, this person's going to come in and they're going to have 5 weeks to move everything, but we're not really going to think about the people it's actually going to affect. We're going to think about things like the army and whatever,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
um
mean, to that point about the Brit aspect, as a Brit myself, there have been documents that have been published in recent years where it's been clear that that there was a divide and conquer policy that was basically going on, which is a very colonial power thing to do, but that
mhm.
was basically what was going on. I mean, the idea that you could have East Pakistan or West Pakistan, like, hundreds of miles apart, was just a non-starter from the
Yeah.
beginning. But also the way that the Kashmir, the lines were drawn there, obviously seeds of discontent that
Mhm.
are going on today, and like you said, have influenced the relationship between these two countries. So
Yeah,
to your point, I just wondered, I don't know if you caught the recent Disney Miss Marvel series, because they actually touched on partition, which
they
was
did.
very,
Yes.
which was very surprising. And like you said, hasn't really been done before. Um, do you think teaching about India, Pakistan's partition in schools and the colonial legacy that we've just been talking about will help South Asian families and especially children better understand their own place in history and how they fit into the West with their immigrant ancestry?
Um, I would hope so. And also going back to Miss Marvel, I actually didn't know partition was going to be a storyline before the show started, and then when I was watching it, I saw it. And the director, Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, actually directed episodes 4 and 5 of Miss
She
Marvel.
did. You're
Yes.
right. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So I was like, so I'm trying to talk to her, and hopefully it'll work out
Yeah,
because it'll
yeah.
be very full circle. But she's very busy,
Yes.
so hopefully it'll work out. But yeah, so that's my hope, because that's kind of what I want this podcast to be, because I spoke to an author. Her name's Nisad Hajari. He wrote a book called Midnight's Furies about partition, and I used some of his passages in the second episode, and we just kind of had like an informal conversation. And the first thing he told me was that you can't cover everything, and that's
Mhm.
true. Like, there's just too much,
Yeah.
like, and so you just kind of have to pick what you want to talk about and then do that well, or at least the best of my ability. And
To that point, was there anything in the research that you did that maybe really kind of shocked or surprised you? I mean, obviously you didn't know much about the whole subject by itself, but was there anything, whether it was a fact figure or an event that happened within partition that really kind of like blew your mind?
I think it was women, just learning about the number of women who were raped and
Mm.
kidnapped um, and like forcefully converted to the other's religion. And then a lot of people went missing at the end of like what's that word? Like the columns of people walking. It starts with a K. Gosh, what's that called? But like I'll find it. But
Mhm.
and just kind of getting kidnapped there, and like like men would kind of set their eye on older women to get inheritances and houses. And I was just like, what? Like, it was just like, so that's such a crazy concept to me.
Mhm.
And, really using rape as a weapon as well. I mean, obviously rape, and I get into that subject. The next two episodes exclusively talk about women and their experiences.
Yeah.
And it's just like, rape in general is just an insane concept. But
Yeah.
then adding it as like a weapon of war,
Mhm.
or a side effect of war,
Yeah.
which is it's been described, is just something else that just really blew my mind. And also the number of women who were murdered for the sake of honor by their
Mm.
own male family members. I was like, that's so unimaginable to me. And I know like things like this exist, like honor killings exist, and things like that. But I don't, that's not something I see in my everyday life, right?
Of course. No.
And then just like seeing this, and I'm just like, how can people be so, maybe it's naive, but I'm also just like, how can people be so cruel? And I guess when you make a strong enough divide, and there's so much confusion and panic, that people lash out in different ways. But I was just like, how could you do that to your own
And
family? And
sometimes I think did hear stories many years ago about, sometimes it was like a whole community or village of people
yes,
would, sacrifice or kill their women folk
yes,
because they
yeah.
feared what was going to happen if,
Right. They're like, you might
yeah,
get converted. So we need
yeah,
to, you need to, like, this, your life needs to end so that doesn't
yeah,
happen. And I'm like, you would rather see your sister dead than
yeah,
a possible situation that may or may not happen.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it's just,
I
yeah.
mean,
I think
yeah,
that was really the really, really hard part.
I
And
can,
also the, um, like, there was like no mercy given to any kind of age group, especially children. And
mm,
my great aunt was actually born on August 15th, 1947.
mhm,
And obviously she doesn't remember
yeah,
anything. But I asked her, like, like, what did people tell you? And she said this like horrific thing that is in the third episode, about how if men on both sides saw pregnant women, they would like cut their bellies open and take their
oh
fetuses,
my god, yeah,
and either like lay it beside the woman or burn it like on a pit. And I'm like, what? And I was just like, that, I was like, that can't be true. But I read it in several
it
books.
happened, yeah,
And also the book that the woman I interviewed wrote, it's a historical fiction novel, but there's a
yeah,
scene that's like that. And it's like, that actually happened. And
yeah,
I was just like, these are like, I was just like, I was like, this isn't even a person
yeah,
yet. And it's just like, and it's also children. A lot of
mhm,
so many stories were just like, this woman saw her 1-year-old cousin like impaled by a spear. And I'm like, what is happening? It's just,
yeah, yeah,
that's really rough. And that's kind of been one of the really hard parts about telling the story, because even though it's a very important story and it's something that people don't know about, it's incredibly draining
yeah,
to research everything, figure out what needs to be in there. And then when you have like when I write the scripts, I write them in Google Docs, and it's just like, here's 8 pages of pure terror, that
mm,
I have to say. And it's difficult. And but it's it's like my, not me being uncomfortable, but my kind of like experiences, unpleasant experiences with researching this and stuff, is a small
mhm,
price to pay for a number of people learning about it. And like, going back to your other question, because I ramble a lot, is that if it is taught in schools, like, hopefully people will be like will ask their family, like, what is our
mhm,
story? Because like, I don't think I ever did this. But I see in TV all the time about like, we're doing a family tree, and then like that kid asks about like their family
yeah,
history, and
yeah.
I'm like, I never did that. Like, then maybe I would have known earlier.
Honestly, I think you're right. I don't think, yeah, I
I've
feel like so
never
many
seen that
South
in real
Asians,
life.
yeah, you don't think about that. I
Yeah,
don't know if it's because we're like, a lot of us are immigrants, in Western countries. So maybe we feel like we don't have a history. They all kind of
yeah.
start here, but
But
I
like,
think,
I just moved here, but then I was like, but you do have a
of
history,
course, yeah,
And yeah, and I think that concept is a little lost, like when you're younger, because especially for me, like growing up in the South and being Muslim, like I wasn't really in tune with like my culture and religion. Like I consider myself a Muslim and all these things, but I wasn't like, like and I was like religious
Immersed,
classes and all
yeah,
that stuff. Yeah, but I wasn't like, but that's because my parents made me, right? It wasn't like
yeah,
this like
yeah,
natural
yeah.
curiosity I had because, like that society that you live in, like you're kind of taught to suppress things that make you different. And then it's also you're looked down upon if like you're speaking a different language or your skin is
Mhm.
darker or you bring food from home that's like specific to your culture that probably has a very strong smell that
Yeah,
like all the
yeah.
other kids are like, what do you have for lunch? Like, you know what I mean? So
Exactly. And you don't want to be
so
different. The one thing you don't
right,
want to do is
exactly.
stand out
So
at that age.
yeah, so it
Yeah.
wasn't until it was like I was in college at UT
Mhm.
that I was, I really like experienced other things,
Yeah. That you had the confidence to kind of,
Yeah,
approach
and it's
that.
also like different from what I grew up, right? Because I'm just like, there's so many other South Asian people. There's so many people of different cultures, religions, backgrounds, and
Absolutely.
like this sprawling campus.
Uh,
There's
it's
like Latinx
safer. Yeah. You
Greek
have that
life
safety
and
net.
South
Yeah.
Asian. Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
just like you have the freedom to explore in however you want to, which may not really be the case when you're like at home, or just like really like because like you're very sheltered until
Yeah.
like you go
Absolutely.
out and do your own thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to, we sadly run out of time, but I just wanted to say, I think that, this topic, obviously it's very dense and it's been in many ways, I think, very, you know, uh, intense for you, obviously, but I think it's just a really important thing to do. And I think it's absolutely, I actually believe that it's, these, how many people do we have left to give these oral
Yeah, that's
histories,
another
right?
thing, right?
That's another really important point. So I think it's actually the timing is absolutely important. That we look to our elders and people in the community who have that knowledge and try to pass on that knowledge, and as you say, we'll learn from that. There's so many things that we will contextualize about our lives and our parents' lives and where we stand. So just wanted to thank you so much for joining us and for doing this podcast. Really looking
Thank
forward
you.
to it, and hopefully we'll speak to you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. It was so good to talk to you.